thank Ryan Helfenbein and the team at Standing for Freedom Center and Liberty University for allowing us to be here with you this afternoon. And with that, I really want to make sure that we jump right into things because we only have about 30 minutes to have one of our discussions. But this, I hope, will be something that will be edifying for you and as well will help empower you with boldness to then go out and engage not only the culture but politics and make sure that we right things in this nation again. Well, Dr. Lindsay, our topic that we're supposed to be discussing today is the broader implications of critical race theory. But could you just quickly give an overview of really, in a way that people can just take some quick notes to understand really what critical race theory is from your definition?
Okay, Mike. So a critical race theory is a critical theory of race. It's really, so I did that on purpose. I'm going to unpack it a bit, but I did it on purpose because what you're going to hear about critical race theory all the time is that it's complicated, it's deep, it's this difficult legal scholarship, blah, blah, blah. No, it's actually about as deep as a mud puddle. It's about as broad as a Great Lake. Just says the same thing about a bajillion different ways, which is that this is what I think what you want me to drive at. What I say critical race theory boils down to as a critical theory of race is it is the belief that people who have access to whiteness, which includes white people and now also Asians, apparently, welcome. On behalf of my people, people who have access to whiteness have organized society to their own benefit, and that only people who have been trained with the proper consciousness can understand that. That's what a critical theory of race is. So race becomes, as Gloria Ladson-Billings put it, she's an education critical race theorist because it's not in schools, who wrote the paper Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education in 1995 because it's not in schools. And she put in that paper that critical race theory, the point of it is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality. What understanding inequality means is understanding inequality as a Marxist would understand inequality. This is summarized by Charles Mills, who recently died, who's a critical philosopher of race. I'm told that's not the same as a critical race theorist by some of the people on the internet. He wrote a book, I should say, in 2003 called From Class to Race that outlines how critical race theory is Marxism redefined out of class and in terms of race. And so a critical theory then becomes what Isaac Gottsman, an education theorist at Iowa, critical education theorist, says is critical Marxism, which is the turn that happened in the mid-20th century that we call neo-Marxism. We've heard the word cultural Marxism a lot thrown around so far at this conference. It's similar to that. It's derived from that. We've heard Max Horkheimer's name mentioned. He was the father of critical theory, or in other words, critical Marxism. And a critical theory holds, as Marx would have it, that there is an idealized vision of society, that's one. Two, that you must understand how the existing society does not live up to that ideal and critique it. And three, you must inspire social activism or praxis on behalf of attempting to achieve this idealized society. In other words, it is a utopian vision for society they call racial justice as a component of social justice that will be achieved through administering a forced social and cultural economy called racial equity for long enough to become spontaneous. In other words, it's race Marxism.
And so, in many ways, almost within a religious context, that this whole movement of what's been happening with critical race theory, with critical social justice, I think better defined as a broader movement, is that this does take on a lot of religious, if you almost will, religious connotations to it and applications. Would that be the case?
I mean, it's fundamentally religious. And we've heard from Virgil Walker earlier. He did a great job outlining how it, in fact, is religious. It's absolutely, we all say godless communists. It's actually, this is not correct. Communists are not godless, and I hate to tell you, they're not actually atheistic in the sense that they believe there is no God, because you cannot reject and rebel against that which you don't believe exists. And Marx explicitly said his goal was to tear down God, which means he must believe that such a thing means something. And so this is a fundamentally anti-God religion, and it's using race to achieve its anti-God aims. It has a belief. I actually want to frame it out. This is something that I do. It's fairly controversial, so bear with me. As a pagan faith in the postmodern era. Pagan faiths in the pre-modern era looked to things like Zeus, or to Apollo or to some kind of a personified deity, because that's the way they thought of deities. And of course, the Christian faith does not have a personified deity except in the person of Christ, which is a special circumstance, because God is beyond personification in the Christian tradition. So you had these pagan religions in the pre-modern era actually personified their deities. Zeus is a kind of a super person that comes down and, impregnates women and causes all kinds of calamities and throws lightning bolts and whatever else. Well, in the modern era, which is when Marx would have been writing, we no longer are relying on pre-modern personifications of powers, if you will, to use the Tolkien term for how he describes the way the world is shaped, the powers of the world. You use systems, superstructures, as a matter of fact. Superstructures in the postmodern era condense to structures and, in fact, discourses, the way that things are spoken about and represented, the way that they are given in symbols and semiotics. So what you have actually is power structures like systemic racism or white supremacy or patriarchy and misogyny or cis-heteronormativity or ableism and disableism, or fat phobia and thin normativity that become tantamount, I know that one's funny, that become tantamount to pagan gods, but they are instead societal systems that operate through people rather than through the personification of a deity. So what you actually have is a rebirth of paganism in a new context that doesn't look like paganism. And I mean that quite literally. And so the Marxian goal to tear down, not even tear down, but to invert the order of society. If we take God as a symbol of the order of society, his goal is to tear down and invert that. You must have a very religious metaphysic behind that. We can talk about Hegel's metaphysic and how Marx brought that in, but we can also, get very simplistic and just say you have these powers, systemic powers that order society, and we are the playthings of the power systems of the gods, so that you are structurally determined, as they say. If you happen to be black, you're structurally determined to be oppressed racially, and you must know yourself and experience yourself that way, which gives rise to what they call a unique voice of color that is determined. Your character is determined by the interaction you have with the power structure. If you're white, you are also structurally determined by privilege to be willfully ignorant, to be privileged, to be comfortable. And so they say things like that white comfort must be disrupted, must be confronted everywhere it exists. Anything that whites find makes them comfortable must be challenged and disrupted. So you really need to think of this as a religious structure that has a seriously metaphysical belief system, which I just outlined, which is that if you give power to the enlightened Gnostics of this structural Gnosticism or scientific Gnosticism, if you give them all the power and let them administer the world under a dictatorship of, say, the proletariat, if we're talking about class, or of the anti-racists, if we're talking about Kendi with his constitutional amendment, if you let them administer equity long enough, it will transform into an automatic system called justice that is the equivalent of a man in himself, heaven on earth, that totally denies and negates God, just like Marx wanted to do.
So where we would see Hegel actually taking this, and where basically his form in terms of how we arrive at something like this, and it's the structure of it, can you explain to the folks that are here really Hegel's influence on what would eventually be what we have now?
Yeah, so we all know Marx. Everybody knows Marx. Not as many people know Hegel. Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, GWF Hegel. So Hegel preceded Marx. He had a very complicated systematic philosophy that is based on what's called the dialectic. The dialectic is often framed as that you have some concept that is the thesis, some ideas put forth. You are to collide that with its antithesis, and from that derive a more complete synthesis. An example that I've given of dialectical thinking in the Hegelian frame would be somebody says the sky is blue. That's a thesis. And somebody says, as antithesis, they could say, for example, they could say, no, it's not. It's green. Those are two different examples, by the way. No, it's not is a direct negation. No, it's green is a negation by implication, because you've said it's something else instead of blue. But the kind of crafty linguistic swindle that exists within the Hegelian dialectic is to try to throw it into a broader frame and say, well, not at night, when all of a sudden it's supposed to blow your mind open. But what it actually is a misdirection. When you said the sky is blue, you meant during the day when there's no clouds, right? You meant something that you didn't necessarily state in perfect precision. And so the Hegelian dialectic is actually based in what is known as negative thinking. It is the idea that you're going to take a thing and you're going to use some kind of a weird little linguistic trick to bring up its negative and somehow get something greater. They call it in Marxism sublation. They call it in German Aufheben, which means simultaneously to abolish, to keep, and to lift up onto a higher platform. Aufheben actually means to hold onto. So Auf is on and Haben is have or hold. And so it means to lift up and hold onto a higher level. They call it sublation. So the idea is that somehow by colliding something with something less, that you make it something more, which is obviously alchemy. It turns out that Hegel's whole philosophy, he had a whole idea that everything runs dialectically. And if you want to know, the book Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which was written in 2001 by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, actually says in the book, by no accident, it's on page 100 and something, I could look it up on the spot if you want me to. I have it in my phone. It actually says blah, 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 and so the dialectic progresses. So critical race theory is a Hegelian dialectical faith. Marxism is also, and that's why critical race theory is. Marx took this dialectical idea of Hegel and imported it into the material realm. He called his program dialectical materialism, which was a belief that the material reality sets the conditions of life, and that unfolds dialectically by bringing up a thing and its contradiction, colliding the contradictions, or as Lenin said, accelerate the contradictions so that people will see them. And that's actually how history, with a capital H, as deity, progresses. For Hegel, it's a little bit more complicated. He actually took the idea, the most fundamental ontological question, what is being? What is nothing? How do they compare? He saw those as dialectical opposites. And he said, well, for something to be, it must have come out of non-being, and so there was a process, and so the synthesis is becoming. And so all of a sudden, you now have a process-oriented ontology to all of existence, including human history. Marx believed, and this is core to the Marxist religion, which means it's also core to the critical race theory worldview. Marx believed that if there is a God, then human beings are dependent upon that God. If there is, even if we go to like the deistic framing of many of the founding fathers of the United States, if they believe that there is a creator that has nothing to do with the world afterwards, no personal relationship, no Christian stuff, even there, that there's capital N nature, and that we are beholden to nature, Marx believed that for man to be truly independent, he must be man in himself. There must be no such thing. So the entire natural order, the entire belief of a deity must be torn down. We cannot be made imago Dei, because if we are made in the image of God, then we are subject to God, and the goal is, then man is not actually independent. So that you can see that this is the same myth that's in Genesis at the beginning with the snake, being reenacted in a new context. For Hegel, it gets a little weirder because he believed, in fact, that the ideas, the philosophy, his philosophy, in fact, the perfected idea of the world is, well, he called it the absolute. The absolute idea is like the Father, just to put it in the Trinitarian, because he was translating the Trinity into his dialectical becoming framework, the Trinitarian model. And then nature becomes the Son, but in particular, in his own words, this is a direct quote from Hegel, the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. So all of a sudden, the state becomes Jesus. And then that gives rise to what he called the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the Geist. And the Geist, the Weltgeist, slowly through this process of cyclically becoming. So you have the ideas of society, the philosophy give rise to a state. The state administers the philosophy that gives rise to a culture. The culture then adapts accordingly and gives rise through revolution after revolution after revolution to a new state. And so now you have a process of history spiraling around and around and around. All Marx did was take this, what he called he said that this is has a rational kernel hidden within a mystical shell. And all he did was he claimed that he removed it from the mystical shell by shifting out of the idealistic frame of Hegel and shifting into the materialist view of nature and its ideal expression as the state. So if you wonder how else it's religious, Marxist belief structures hold the state as in the same position as Christ. for Christians. And you can see how dangerous and perverse and exactly opposite to Christianity that is. That's something very important for this crowd. It is, in fact, inverted Christianity. It is exactly the opposite of the Christian message. It is not compatible with Christianity. And therefore, when we get to critical race theory some 150 years later, that's also fundamentally incompatible with Christianity, because now, although it's moved into the cultural realm, the Geist, it's moved around the circle to another position. Hegel is the ideal, Marx is the material, critical race theory and the cultural Marxists are in the cultural, or the Geist, the spirit. Now you have the same exact becoming of history program that rejects and inverts the natural order and the theistic order and replaces it with their program, where the state becomes the natural administrator, the culture becomes the place where it is moved, and through one revolution after another, perpetual revolution as they refer to it, we achieve the eventual state of justice by working out all of those, say, racial contradictions.
So this crowd, I would imagine, almost everybody here, especially in Virginia, would understand how critical race theory has manifested itself within education, correct? And so everybody, I think, has been made quite aware of that. And in fact, Dr. Lindsay has been instrumental in making sure that some of those things have been pointed out. But in a broader context, critical race theory, critical social justice, how is this going to affect all of us, not just through education, but what in other areas do we see it?
I mean, so critical race theory is a lens. So if we were going to go totally into kind of theology, we would say it's an eisegetical lens. It's an outside lens applied to seeing everything in the world. This is why, by the way, I keep hearing it from you people. Stop it. Critical race theorists are not indoctrinating your children. They are programming your children. It's far worse. It is far worse. I hear people get on TV and say, we need to teach our children how to think, not what to think, and the critical race theorists are laughing at you. They are teaching them how to think. They're teaching them to think that everything is polarized, stratified by race, and everything is a racial conflict. They are programming them to think that racism is at the bottom of every single thing possible. So how is it going to impact you? Well, you seed education for 50 years to this kind of a program, and you're going to see. The belief is, that used to be, nobody's this naive anymore. It used to be, these kids will graduate and they'll get out into the real world and it'll knock them around and straighten them out. No, they're going to go out and reshape the real world. Come hell or high water. They will break the thing because they don't know how it works, and they make it. The goal is to make every single thing, whether it's your company, whether it's your church, whether it's your school, it doesn't matter. Whether it's your football team, whether it's your knitting club, your hobbies, whatever, it doesn't matter. Every single thing has to become a mechanism, a machine for building racial consciousness, they call it, which if we back up, that's shorthand, by the way, for a critical consciousness of race. So we go back to the neo-Marxists, that's a critical consciousness, and a critical consciousness is the revamping in the 20th century of what Marx referred to as class consciousness, which is an awakened state of believing that the world is separated into oppressed versus oppressor. We've all heard this, and that there is an intrinsic conflict between those that is mediated by what was referred to as, here's that D word again, the master-slave dialectic, such that the people in the oppressed positions, whether the economically oppressed for vulgar Marxism, whether it's the racially oppressed in critical race theory, have double sight. They are aware of things. This is why they say that white people have willful and white ignorance in their privilege. They are aware of things that the people, the racially oppressed are aware of things that the racially privileged cannot be aware of. Namely, what it's like to live as somebody who is oppressed by this racial system, whereas the people who are privileged get to just live in the system without ever having to be aware of what oppression is. And so you will find it in literally everything. And the goal is to teach everybody to think in a way such that every single thing you encounter, whether it's this school, whether it's any school, it will be reorganized so that every single person that comes in contact with it, every single bit of resources that it has at its disposal will be repurposed just to making more critical race theorists. Why? Because their central tenet of faith is that if you have enough critical race theorists with awakened consciousness, this is Gnosticism, by the way, if you have enough Gnostics who are awake and you give them power and they administer the Gnostic world order for long enough, it will eventually stick. Herbert Marcuse, the great neo-Marxist of the 1960s, said that this will introject a new morality into human beings until it changes them at the fundamental biological level so that they need this new system. So they believe if they administer equity long enough, it will become spontaneous and become justice, racial justice. On the other hand, if we went back in time to Marxism, if you administer socialism long enough with an iron enough fist, it will become communism when all the contradictions work out. It's the exact same model. So it will touch every aspect of your life, every single interaction, every single socially tinged phenomenon, even sitting by yourself in your room, has to be read through the lens of race. You're sitting alone in your room because you don't want to have an uncomfortable racial interaction if you went out into public, blah, blah, blah. Every single thing must be interpreted in terms of this so that they can maximize the number of critical race theorists, so that they can get sufficient numbers to establish a dictatorship that will be accepted, so that they can force this crap on everybody until they believe, as a tenet of evil faith, that it will work this time, as I think we heard somebody say last night.
And so when you see things like diversity, equity, inclusion, when you see climate justice, when you see all these other manifestations, health equity and so forth, all of this is coming from the same root.
That's right. So, yeah, so all of these things are the same thing. All of these things are the same thing. In fact, you could even make a pretty plausible argument that conditioning people to think in terms of separate classes, one of which is scapegoated, and the cause of all the problems in society paved the way for the vaccine versus unvaxxed dialectic, which is the dialectical conflict. So now all of a sudden, we're all used to thinking, oh, there's some group out there that maybe is even a minority group, or maybe it's a majority, maybe it's a minority, that's causing all the problems for everybody else. You've been conditioned to think this way for a decade, 2 decades. You've been taught to think this way in your schools. How is this vaccine situation any different? It's not. But it's going to touch into every single component. You got to think that critical race theory is not the thing. It's like a hydra, if you want a mythological thing. It's like there's this dragon, and it has like 10 heads. Critical race theory is just one head. You chop it off, and you've got queer theory. You chop that one off, you've got critical gender theory waiting to say, no, not quite so far. You chop that one off, you've got fat studies. By the time you chop fat studies head off, that's real, I'm not kidding. I know, it's hilarious. Up comes the critical race theory head again. And so everything is going to be measured in terms of these social metrics, which would compare also against like environmental, we mentioned climate justice, and also best practices governance metrics, ESG, this being the new hot thing in business. The goal is to think of every single possible thing in terms of oppressor-oppressed dynamics and a dialectic that will unfold to a perfect history if we can just accelerate the contradictions, put the conflicts out there, and use that as a justification to redistribute from the privileged, as they are defined by the theorists, to the underprivileged or the oppressed. So with climate justice, climate change is mostly generated by rich Western nations and mostly impacts poor Southern and Eastern nations. So now we have to have a massive redistribution of wealth from, say, the United States and the other wealthy nations to the third world. We also have to open our borders to allow people to flee those impacts that we have allegedly generated in an oppressed or oppressed conflict. Within health, you're going to see these aspects like race theory and gender theory, et cetera, applied in a medical model that's going to lead to, well, it is actually already has led to in Harvard teaching hospitals, into prioritization of care by race. We saw the attempt to prioritize the vaccine by race, which blew up phenomenally in their faces because of the Tuskegee experiments, and the memory of that is not quite gone. But we will see this mentality forced into everything. The neo-Marxist move in the 60s was they realized that capitalism works. Believe it or not, Marxists realized that capitalism works. Herbert Marcuse, the archbishop of critical theory in the 60s, said it gives people a good life. Max Horkheimer said Marx believed it would immiserate the workers, but it does not. It allows them to build a better life. And Marcuse even says it is, in fact, a good life. But it's not a liberated life. In other words, it's not a communist life. It's not a perfect life. It's not a utopian life. Hold up an idealized vision for society, criticize the existing society for not being that, inspire social activism on its behalf. That's a critical theory. And so they realized that we have this problem, that capitalism has stabilized the working class. So screw you, working class, for having a good life and a home and a family and liking your football team and being able to get some cool swag and have a cool car that you appreciate and wash on the weekends and waste resources, of course, how environmentally irresponsible of you. Screw you, working class. You are now a counter-revolutionary force, according to the neo-Marxists. So they said, what are we going to do? Let's blow it into identity politics. Look at all the energy of the 60s. The sexual liberation movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the civil rights movement, all that radical energy, and then all these angry, disaffected minorities in each of these different domains. How do we cobble them together into a kaleidoscopic, as the word goes, understanding of identity and oppression and relate those things? And so they completely reframed it, and now you have to think, the framework became called intersectional in the 1980s and early 1990s. Now you have to think about everything in terms of an intersectional framework, and every single facet of your life, if they get their way, will be intended to be filtered through that lens. Positionality, they say, must be intentionally engaged.
So with everything that you have in your life, in other words, in which you would say, Dr. Lindsay before referred to really accelerating the contradictions and everything, but you're seeing that within every facet of your life right now when you're wondering why everything is in chaos about you. And so just bring us home in the last 5 minutes, really, where can people see this and where can they know where to stand up?
I mean, you got to stand up wherever you see it, but you also have to stand up with discernment. It's not possible to fight a Marxist movement without discernment. So if you're going to pray for something, pray for discernment. And then also, don't just pray, go look up words, because that's what you have to discern. We've already heard, they manipulate language.
Sustainability.
Sustainability is a big one, yeah, right? So here's what you actually have to understand. The goal that you are fighting against is to turn whatever your thing is into a critical theorist-making machine. So your church is going to say Jesus-y things, but it's going to be professing the woke gospel. Your school is going to be saying educational things, but it's going to be professing the woke gospel. Your climate minister, which will be coming, is going to be talking about environmental and scientific sounding things, but he's actually professing the woke gospel. The goal is to get every single thing on the planet to profess the exact same super ecumenical belief that's boiled down to a critical theory of literally everything, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's climate, whether it's health, doesn't really matter, whether it's religion. The same message said from 1,000 different voices and 1,000 different words, but the exact same thing. Church, mosque, mass, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be saying woke in the clothes or the language of that thing. So where do you stand up? You stand up where you see it. How do you learn to see it? You need discernment. How do you get discernment? Well, I'm speaking to this audience. I should say that you should pray for it. That said, you actually have to deal with the fact, as we've heard, that Virgil was very good on this too, they use deceptive language. You have to understand that every woke specialist term is an agenda. Every single one. Words like diversity, you cannot assume. It's an everyday word. You can't assume you know what it means unless you ask. So you must demand the definition, and in fact, you must demand the opposite. You must demand, we're going to use this very narrow dictionary definition and not any other definition and put it in writing. You have to stand up. But the place you need to stand up the most, I hate to say it, is actually for and in the schools. Because if we could eradicate all of this by fiat with a magic wand, I know we don't do magic wands here in Christian places, but if we had one, I know, bear with me, I'm not a pagan. If we had one and we could eradicate this from society everywhere except the schools, we're back in the same place in 10 years.
Yep.
Because they are creating a new generation to think this way again. When you reach to your children, it's not that you have to just teach them. If they're in government schools and if they're engaged in this culture, which they are, even if they're not in government schools, you actually will largely have to deprogram them from the programming they've received to think in terms of stratified conflict, to use formal terminology, to think that we are divided in every possible aspect, and you have to actually reprogram them, and I hate to say that word, but you have to get them back to thinking in terms of reality, which is that we are all human beings who all share a common humanity. For Christians, that everybody has the same access should they choose to accept it at the cross. You have to bring them back to commonality amongst one another and to say that, no, we're not in conflict. We're actually individuals who all have something huge in common, who are struggling through this life, and we can do it better if we do it together in a way that recognizes that each person gets to think for themselves, just like we realized so importantly about 250 years ago when we founded this country.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there's one thing I can leave you with, it's this. We must win. There is no lose in this. This is for all of our ideology. It's for all of our lives. It's for our nation. It's for your church. It's for the body of Christ. And it's for Western civilization. Would you please thank Dr. James Lindsay? Appreciate you.